Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the third in the Bidwell series that we've called the Future of Residential Development. It's good to see that so many of you have joined us despite it being such a nice, warm, sunny day outside. So hopefully we can keep you engaged over the next 45 minutes. Just a quick recap of the last two sessions that we've done. We've heard from Mark Buddle and Giles Dobson talk about the changing roles of landowners, developers and promoters, and looking at a model whereby landowners can take a longer term view and look at value over the long term. At the session 2 weeks ago, we then heard from Mark and Nick Pettit looking at how you can drive value through development management. And there we used one of our current schemes, a case study at Dunsfold Park, to sort of start to tease some of that out. Today, you're going to hear from Nick Pettit again, as well as our head of the Urban Design Studio, and David Bentley, our head of residential. They're going to be looking at balancing the costs of building better, looking at the opportunities and challenges of delivering to ever sort of increasing sustainability standards and environmental performance, and ultimately what impact that has on the end product. And we'll start with about 20 minutes worth of presentations, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. Please do use the bar at the bottom to get your questions through. It's been a lively sort of debate so far.
Thanks, Neil. I think we've got a bit of a technical problem on your line, so we'll carry on. Just as a recap, what we outlined originally was that there is this opportunity for the master developer role, the person staying in, the developer staying in the land transaction for a lot longer. We've said this is not for all, and we know that this is a development option that runs alongside all the other development options that you have. It's for the long-term perpetual investor, because really what it does is it embeds the money in there for a lot longer. Now, why would you do that? Well, hopefully you're doing that because what you're actually looking for is a longer term better return of between 15 to 20% uplift. Now, why would we, or what are the implications of this? Well, in 2025, the Future Home Standards will be introduced into the UK, which will make the UK one of the most forward-thinking countries in the world. They're striving to get to a net carbon zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050, and that's going to be a challenge for all of us. It'll be a challenge because regulation will have to come in and drive that change, but also because what we are seeing is that there's a move in the open market for us as individual owners of properties to actually want to live in a much more sustainable and environmentally controlled position. So the developer is actually getting squeezed from regulatory terms and from the house purchaser. So what will these regulations really mean? Well, they will mean that we will have to look at the whole building energy performance and possibly the whole development site energy performance, which will mean that we've got to look at the types of buildings we deliver, their insulation standard, their carbon reduction in terms of the embedded carbon within the buildings, to change the type of heating systems that we have in place, and generally get to a much more efficient delivery solution and a much more operationally efficient model. On one of the schemes that we're looking at the moment, we are considering whether or not we go with the passive house option, which is obviously one of the benchmark standards that we know that can deliver this. Now, in real figures, what does that really mean? Well, if you were to look at the RIBA challenge that is targeting net zero by 2030, there's some quite incredible reductions in energy use that we need to look at. The operation of the building is going to be targeted at a 75% reduction in the way in which the house consumes energy. One challenge that we know that the marketplace is not responding to yet is that we'll need to change the way in which we construct dwellings. The embedded energy in construction solutions with brick, steel, concrete is not great, and therefore we are going to have to think about how we deliver that. Another challenge will be looking at how we use water. Water will need to be collected and reused on sites much more than we are doing at the moment. It's quite often considered and it is evaluated and put to one side because it still appears to be too expensive to operate. And then finally, the component that we are all trying to understand now is how do we make sure that the health and well-being of all of the occupants of the housing is available to all, and what solutions can we bring into the design master plans to make this work? There's some quite challenging targets there for us all to look for. I mean, the question for us all is really, why do we need to do this? Well, we know that before COVID hit us, the climate temperature change was projected to exceed the 1.5 degrees that we think is acceptable, and it's fast heading towards 2%, which is unsustainable for us all to live on the planet. Any building that we build will actually be much healthier and much more economic to run. So there are advantages for the end purchaser to actually have a building that is more economic to occupy. And ultimately, what we're trying to give everybody is a healthier environment to live in. Now, the traditional focus has always been on actually trying to drive this out of the buildings in their own way, the design of the buildings. But when you are the master developer, what you need to be looking at is actually how you hold on to and embed some of the wider site strategies into the development process. Again, as an example, our Dunsfold project down in Surrey, we have considered the utilisation of district heating. At the moment, that hasn't been adopted. We are using solar arrays and battery storage in order to try and manage peak electrical flow times. We're looking at the much wider transport systems, supported bus systems, electric cars, cycling, to mitigate against the wider environmental impact. The areas of waste collection, waste management, wastewater collection and management are all being considered at the moment as well, to try and ensure that what we are doing is embedding site-wide sustainable solutions in that the developer can tap into and use as a sales feature, rather than just trying to take the most value out of the housing unit in its own right. You will never get there if you only look at the cost and the sustainable provisions within the delivery of the house unit itself. Now, they're challenging because are they viable? And this is always going to be a chicken and egg for us. We need to make sure that we are looking at utilizing these solutions, because the more that we use them on buildings, the more economic they will become. And I know Danielle will talk about these a little bit more in her speech. The natural assumption is that these all cost money and therefore the project becomes much more expensive. But there are solutions that you can look for. So for example, when we're looking at the implications of the electrical energy and using solar arrays and batteries, it means that we can actually reduce the level of cost of our infrastructure going into the building, because we don't need as much electricity generated by the utility providers. The electrical equipment in the building, and particularly the air source heat pumps, will use more of it. Therefore, our load is greater. But that provision can be provided for on site if you have enough capacity to be able to do that, either from the roof spaces having solar arrays on, or indeed separate locations of field areas if possible. The other component which we obviously need to be very careful with is the well-being. And again, looking at our country park solution at Dunsfold, we have 5 kilometres of cycleway around the site. We have allotments embedded in it. We have shared use facilities that are far greater than any other sports facility that you would see on some developments. So the holistic package that we put to the residential developer is one that they need to buy into, and hopefully will then create value for them and for the landowner at the end of the day. It's fair to say that early adopters on the site will be the ones that will not be the ones that generate that extra level of profit. Our phasing of the works will probably mean that the initial phases 1 and 2, which will be somewhere around 6 to 100 homes, will struggle to generate that level of return that we are looking for. But if you get your brand image right, you get all of the sustainability credentials right, and you live and breathe by those principles in every development parcel that gets sold, you will start to get a return. And David will cover this later in his part of the presentation. There is an element of a leap of faith here, but the market has to change because regulation will change it, and therefore these principles will need to be adopted into any development solution over the forthcoming years. I'll pass on to Daniela now, who will perhaps talk a bit more about the embedded sustainability in the landscape environment.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Nick. So I think it's quite important at the outset when we consider what's driving this trend towards sustainability, is just to underline the fact that sustainability and community are really inextricably linked with ecology. So we can see this quite powerfully in the increase in requirement for health impact assessments for developments, which is really helping to shape the way that neighbourhood designs evolve, how transport strategies are implemented, and the way in which we can start to integrate food production within a master plan. We can also see this in environmental biodiversity net gain, which is starting to really impact on really strategic green infrastructure strategies, and the way in which the natural environment interacts with the proposed development. So this combination of tangible elements that Nick has discussed previously, and also maybe some of the more nebulous concepts around health impact assessment, really start to underline the fact that societal and planetary boundaries are really starting to come to the forefront in the decision-making context. And so with that in mind, it's really good to see that a focus on sustainability and environmental concerns can really deliver tangible long-term benefits, which is something that David will touch on later in a much more economic sense than I'm able to. So what do we mean by sustainability and ecology? So these can include some of the tangible things that Nick's already raised, including things like responsible water management, rubbish and waste management, and energy generation. But it can also include more community-based elements, such as well-being, which may include community food production, a variety of housing types, tenures and affordability, and third spaces. It can include access to social infrastructure and community participation, which can manifest itself in schools, community centres, sports facilities and volunteering options, and also, quite importantly, physical health. So that is integrating into the master plan options for active travel, for sports and fitness, facilities for all, and also access to healthcare. So all of these things will help to address the tangible targets that we're starting to see come into force, but can also be really quite useful in terms of planning and community engagement tools as well. So how do we start to embed sustainability? So first off, early planning is absolutely key. Making sure that you've got the right master planning elements can help to make a developer's life easier. Starting with site selection, considering sustainable transport features is quite important, as is considering existing facilities that could potentially be built on as part of the master plan, such as a local business, which could be extended to create quite an active local centre early on in the scheme. Also worthy of consideration are the site's inherent features to see if they can be used as a point of difference for any development coming forward. So the early delivery of foundational community infrastructure, such as local centres, schools, health facilities, allotments or country parks, can really help when combined with a well-designed and well-considered adoption of some early active and sustainable transport features to build a critical mass which can start to form some community ties around development to start to make it that bit more of a community. So some of those features, such as schools, allotments and country parks especially, really do help to enable the formation of early community groups and volunteering opportunities, which give a slightly more formal avenue for the development of that community. So equally, all of these social infrastructures need to be very, very carefully considered alongside and within a social strategy, a phasing plan and the aims of the development to make sure that all of these elements are delivered in the right place and in the right location to really activate the scheme as a whole, but also to meet the development objectives. So it's quite easy, I think, to envision how that can work on a larger scale site. But on the right, oh, sorry, Matt, could you just go back one? Sorry, thank you. But on the right of the image here, you can see a small project we've worked on with our rural colleagues, which is a small village extension to a village which currently has a population of about 200 people, which seeks to preserve the existing community assets of the village whilst addressing their undersupply of 1 and 2 bedroom properties. The building of a community-led co-working space and a large area of habitat and recreation, which has meant that this project's much more of a community-based project, even though it's delivering on the landowner's aims and objectives. Matt, if you could change over now. So another really important component, which Nick's already touched on, in terms of sustainability is active travel. So prioritising active modes, which is things like cyclists and pedestrians within streetscape design and within the design of the master plan is absolutely viable. So you can start to see that this is becoming part of policy. Just this week, the consultation's gone out to embed this within the highway code. And within the forward to this, written by the PM, you can start to see that he's linking this change to the maintenance of a healthy population and opportunities for environmental improvements, which just goes to show how seriously this is being taken at a policy level. Also vital is the early consideration of public transport. Now, while that needs to be viable, it needs to be phased in such a way to make sure that it becomes a habit for early residents and they don't just pop into the car as the easiest way of getting around. And one of the most important things, I think, is the consideration of private vehicles. So, for instance, is there any way to encourage vehicle sharing? Is the development completely car-free? Is there car-free roads? We also need to consider increasingly, with the move to electric vehicles with the Department of Transport's Road to Zero, what the strategy is for rapid charging, whether that's a plot by plot strategy, whether it's a community level strategy, but that can feed into some of the community and social goals for a development as well. So on a longer term and more strategic level, it's also quite important to ensure that green infrastructure strategies develops that's multifunctional, that combines elements of active travel, play on the way, recreation, ecology and biodiversity for the obvious well-being and social benefit for a scheme. Just as important within that scheme is incidental and third spaces, which if you provide sort of regular, safe and accessible seating, can start to reach groups that are usually quite hard to access, such as teenagers or the elderly. A strong signage and visual wayfinding strategy is also important, as this can over time start to aid long-term independence and encouraging well-being through ageing. And a diverse housing stock from the get-go is quite important. So providing a variety of tenures, affordabilities and sizes means that you're starting to create a bit more of a mixed development, which can be all the better for the social life of the scheme. So all of these things that we've gone through very, very quickly for what is quite a dense and well populated subject is that we will need to apply these principles in new and sophisticated ways to achieve meaningful sustainability and environmental metrics in new developments. I'll now hand over to David, who'll take you through some of the more tangible metrics for schemes such as this.
Thanks, Danny. I'm not sure about tangible metrics. My presentation, ladies and gentlemen, will be relatively simple, but actually I do think it's probably one of the key questions. I'm asked more and more recently from developers, small and large, you know, what if I do this and this from a green agenda? What's it going to pay me back? And quite honestly, it's still a difficult question to answer, but I do genuinely feel the tide is changing. I think we all want to live healthier, cheaper, and, you know, reduce our carbon footprint. Very few of us do not want to embrace green and its benefits. But it's the enhanced value from a client developer side, which is probably a little bit more challenging to answer. But I do genuinely feel it's starting to show, you know, green shoots, and it's changing reasonably well. I can only really use my own experience of developing and selling around Cambridge, which is our core area of operation. You know, Cambridge being the centre of intelligence and with a fairly large green contingent and following, I think it's a fairly good benchmark to review for the appetite on sustainability and value. I'm probably going to wind the clock back about 8 years ago on one of our first large strategic sites around the city that had an option for a sustainable show home. Had a long shopping list of nice to haves from the green agenda, but with a price tag attached. Idea was great, quite exciting at the time, but the take up was very minimal. Whether that was down to how creative we were in selling it, but it never really progressed from there. That was 8 years ago. I think we've taken a very large step forward from a green agenda, and those ideas that Nick and Danny have alluded to, quite frankly, are already out there in our marketplace, but it's the real added value which I'm challenged on more recently. I personally think buyers' perception is changing. The green, and particularly the well-being, has taken a very large step up the specification and requirement ladder. Focusing briefly on the well-being element, you know, we have certainly witnessed an increase in people's personal requirements, health, well-being recently, which is not surprising for any of us. Awareness of, you know, what makes me feel good about where I live, what and who is around me, how easy it all to get to, and by what means, all elements that are on the sustainability agenda and value add. Cambridge particularly already ticks a number of those sustainable boxes, as I'm sure do others out there as well, for those key sort of strategic fringe schemes that were witnessed over the last few years. Clearly recent events have reinforced the importance of outside, and whether you're a keen cyclist or a dog walker, you know, you take a trip around one of Cambridge's country parks or new country parks that surround the city, and they're a hive of activity delivered primarily through our core strategic sites. Water management, I think that's also been incorporated in a number of the projects and adds real impact to a number of those current schemes. District heating is also with us on a few projects. People have embraced this method and its green fortunes, and if it starts to become part of the standard inclusion on large scale schemes, it will be the new norm. There's a host of other things that Danny and Nick have alluded to: grey water, PV, MVHR, air source, all more of the components for sustainability that have been added to the list over recent years and are becoming part of the new norm. We have a large number of projects that incorporate all of those, as I'm sure a number do out there. So I feel we're already on that journey, but I'm sure there's a long way to go. I'm sure there will be others that we need to add to that list, but all for the benefit of the development and the purchaser requirement. The added value part is still the big question. We've witnessed one large-scale development that, quite frankly, I think has pushed the boundaries on sustainability and has genuinely witnessed an improvement in revenues of over 10% over its closest competitor. But as the slide says, is that more apportioned to product, design, where it is, or what it is? Irrespective of whether there is added value through other components, apart from sustainability, I think there is a genuine uplift for going green. And the more purchasers experience the sustainable offerings, the more it will become the new norm. So I have no doubt that green requirements will continue to rise on the development ladder. I'm yet to see it as a top priority for purchasers, but it has been significantly improved over recent years, and I think we will continue to be pressed for it. Cambridge has pushed the boundaries on sustainability and will continue to do so. The pace of change has been relatively slow, but the adding value element versus the cost of implementing remains the challenge. But I personally feel the tide is changing on revenues, and we've witnessed that already, as I'm sure a number have out there. So I said it was going to be short, happy to answer questions. And now it's back over to Neil.
Thanks very much, Nick, David and Danny, for your presentations. I understand that my Wi-Fi connection is not very good, so apologies if the sound's not very clear. I think we're trying to get someone else who potentially can jump on if I cut out at any stage. But we had a couple of questions at the last session from Ben Phillips and Stuart Larkin in response to what Nick had set out on Dunsfold Park. And it's probably a question that a lot of people have got in their minds. What is the impact on viability of pushing for higher environmental standards? And Stuart, what is the impact of cost for delivery of low carbon solutions? So I throw that one straight over to you, Nick, sort of in terms of trying to give a feel for the audience as to where you think that impact on cost is.
Okay, thanks, Neil. As we mentioned earlier, it's not just about the cost of the residential unit, it's actually about the wider infrastructure that we're putting in. And that's difficult to equate back on a cost per unit basis. If you are to look at the implications of comparing what would be a 2025 compliant standard housing unit versus a current housing unit, the exercises that we've done on 2 or 3 projects have shown that there is a cost uplift at the moment of between 5 to 7% on the build price of the unit. But that's predominantly because the components that you're buying to go into this are not as, they're not a high volume commodity at the moment. And the expectation is that as they become much more readily available and more people are buying them, that unit price will drop down. We've seen that with solar arrays, that they've become cheaper over time. So whilst in the first instance at the moment that you are seeing that price uplift, I think by the time we have all got to the point of needing to comply with the Future Home Standards in 2025, the cost parameters will be much more equalised. The next question will then be, how do we drive that standard through to perhaps meet the RIBA 2030 requirements, and then on into the government sort of net zero carbon at 2050? That's difficult to evaluate at the moment. I think we would probably suggest at this point in time that you would see, if you wanted to go all that way, you would see probably a 10% uplift in construction price. But as I say, that we expect to drop over the next 3 to 5 years to parity in terms of where we are on a build price cost per unit now.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Just before I'll bring Danny in a second, but Nick, just staying with you, is there anything that those acting as strategic lead developer can do there in terms of the main infrastructure that they put in on day one to assist with reducing additional costs for house builders coming on board for the residential?
Yeah, I think I think one of the most important ones is actually looking at the utility, the electrical utility infrastructure. Yeah, if we are to drive every housing unit to have solar arrays and battery backups to ameliorate the peak demands, then I think that's quite an expensive way of doing it. I think the site-wide developments can quite easily look at embedding battery power and solar arrays within within the master plan infrastructure, so that that is the one that is managed. Because otherwise, what you end up with is, you know, on 1,000 home sites, you've got 1,000 different sets of batteries to look after, and they'll fail over a period of time, and you're not getting the best value out of them. So that if you manage it as a site-wide infrastructure, you wouldn't need to put 1,000 in. You might only need to put 750 in, because the way in which the utilization works is much more efficient. So that's one area that that we'd certainly look at as the master developer. I think then there are other issues associated with the transport and sustainability across the sustainable transport across the site. You know, over time, the car dependency is going to change, and how quick that comes about is one of the big questions. But trying to assist that to happen by looking at your transport and transport hubs, and where you can interact with transport hubs, and how you can manage that and facilitate the funding of on-demand buses or on-demand cabs, will be something that the master developer, if they stay in as the long-term trust operator or parish operator, can certainly seek to manage in a much more efficient way. That's just a couple of them that we're looking at.
Thanks, Nick. That's really useful. Danny, sort of bringing you in, just wonder, is there anything that the design teams can do at an early stage to help embed the principles in the master plan, which shouldn't add additional cost at an early stage? So it should actually help reduce costs overall by just getting things right from the wall?
Totally. I think it comes down to, on a site-specific basis, really digging into your opportunities and constraints, and trying to understand what the drivers are going to be for phasing as soon as you can do, to make sure that you're creating the optimum conditions to start to build sustainable transport, whether that is a hub itself or whether it is just routes through the site and connecting to existing infrastructure. It has the opportunity then to really create some quite meaningful sort of early doors savings for how you're putting the site together. You know, we've seen in the past that as part of an allocation, for instance, a school might be required, and the obvious location for it's on the far side of the site, which means that all of the infrastructure needs to be built to enable the delivery of that. And that's something that I think, if you have a very engaged design team, is something that you can start to de-risk and design out sooner in the process. But it needs to come about on a site-by-site understanding basis, and also understanding what your developer and landowner are trying to achieve on the site, to make sure that it's appropriate for each development that you're working on as well.
Thanks, Danny. That's useful. David, we've got a question here from Chris Whedon. If you had two identical houses on a development, one with solar PV and the other without, would you advise a higher asking price? And if so, how much more? I think, just to maybe expand on that as well, what if you were going to ask for more, what is the current approach adopted by mortgage and their valuers? Will they recognise that uplift in value?
It's an interesting question. I'd probably say, well, why would you only do one with or without? I mean, if there's going to be an extent of PV panels on a house that's going to give a real contribution back to the purchaser, then you'd like to think, yes, there would be an uplift in value. I don't think I've ever had two identical houses next door to each other, you know, with PV panels on one and not on t'other. If it's just going to heat half my hot tub for like 3 months of the year, then probably not. I don't know whether you're driving that, Chris, but I mean, I think you would expect there to be an uplift if there was a greener house. Whether that's going to be a considerable uplift, I'd say no. But valuers, interesting subject again, Neil, at the moment. I don't want to upset any valuers out there. I'd probably say I think it would be marginal what they would put against an uplift. Depends how much it is. If it's just, you know, a few PV panels, then probably not. Because I think PV are becoming part of the norm, aren't they, on a lot of schemes. I think people are almost expecting that. I don't know whether people fully understand the benefits of that. But there has to be an increase in value the more green we put in. But I think there's lessons to be learned as to how we actually promote it. But it's a good question, Chris.
David, staying on that issue then, do you think house builders need to do more to sell the environmental benefits of more sustainable homes?
Well, I think we've done.
Everyone is probably more focused on upfront capital cost. Is there more education to be done in terms of looking at the long-term?
Well, I think we've done a lot of research on it already, Neil. You know, we've got our graphs comparing, you know, our brand new to a 1930s semi and the uplift on our EPCs, etc. So I think a lot of that has been done. I don't know whether we've embedded it into our sales force as much as we can and the real benefits of it. I think some of our schemes where we've had an awful lot of work gone into our infrastructure and sustainability, I think it's actually then empowering our individuals that sell the houses to actually reinforce what actually we get and the real cost benefit out of it. I'm sure there's a way to go on it, but I'm not criticising what we do. I think there's always more we can do, without question.
Dave, just one quick one, that we're actually looking at embedding some smart technology in the buildings, which means we record the data that comes out of them in terms of their operational cost. So that in future phases of a scheme, that we can actually see what value saving the purchaser can have in their units. Have you seen any of your schemes actually utilise that to date?
I think we've got sort of elements of that throughout some of our schemes, Nick, where the comparison is made against, you know, a more traditional style dwelling compared to what you're living in now. So I think that's been there for a little while. I don't know whether we carry on with that and reinforce that on an ongoing basis. It's difficult to quantify sometimes, isn't it, what we're actually doing? Are you doing me a saving on my water or my, you know, services and electric? I think they're all things that we can labour more the point of. I think the awareness of it is certainly, in my opinion, is raised, particularly through lockdown and just general, you know, well-being and everything around what I do. So if there's a tool out there that shows it, rather than smart meters do linking in, I'm sure that's all part of it. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's actually looking at the smart metering is one of it. It's about drawing on the whole energy consumption element of a building, and then to say, well, how does it perform, and then be able to play that back on a 12-monthly basis, so you've got the information available to future purchase to say, well, look, we know that the last 50 units we sold were, in comparison to a 1930s dwelling, saved this much amount of operational cost. It's something we're looking at doing on one of our schemes to help embed that understanding of sustainability. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's going back to Chris's question, isn't it, as to, well, what savings is it going to give me? I'm probably standing there, I couldn't tell you what savings it's going to give you. You know, we stick them on there, but do we do enough around it? So,
just coming up at that, it's a comment from Marco there that from his experience, he expects that customers want the sustainability measures, but they don't actually want to pay for it. So sort of interesting experience. Danny, coming back to you, obviously you've sort of picked up on the sort of emerging role of health impact assessments. Do you see this as something other than a tick box process that can actually add value to the design and principles of a scheme at an early stage? And how do we avoid it just becoming one of the many reports that need to be included with a planning application?
Yeah, I think it can be a completely valuable piece of work. It's like everything. I think the sooner you get to grips with exactly what is going to be included and how that can impact on your master plan, the more meaningful the results can be. As you say, when they're bolted on at the end and you're creating conclusions based on the findings and sort of retrofitting, I think the impact of a HIA can be somewhat limited. Where it is more like the EIA process is an iterative process that's actually part of the design flow and process, it can really embed into the fabric of the master plan and show you opportunities that you didn't know you had, which can be quite invaluable, I think.
It's probably safe to say that it's probably sort of in and around Cambridge where health impact assessments are probably being more prevalent at the moment. What's your experience of actually sort of engaging with the local authority on those and how have your sort of clients responded to that? Do you think it's actually resulted in sort of tangible benefits?
Yeah, definitely. So our socioeconomics team undertake HIAs quite a bit around Cambridge, and where we've been working with them, you can see completely the difference in the outcome. It may be that you were heading in the right direction, and they've given you the much more baselined and measured metrics to back up what you are already doing, or they can challenge you on exactly how your open space provision is distributed within a given development. And you can start to, through that challenge, really evolve the master plan in a really meaningful direction, which is something that we've been doing with them on a site outside of Cambridge. And so I think it does come back to making sure that they are embedded in the team fairly early doors and given the opportunity to do their baseline research in a time efficient and responsible manner that feeds into master planning outcomes.
Excellent, thanks Danny. And Danny, staying with you, I just want to pick up on one of the comments that you made about the importance of embedding sustainable behaviours from day one. Clearly, to try if people start jumping in their cars from day one, obviously you're on a sort of a downward spiral. But who do you see that responsibility lying with? Is that the strategic lead developer? Is that the house builders selling the plots? Is that a residents association or a management entity? Who do you think it needs to drive that behaviour from the beginning?
I think it's very much a shared project team responsibility. So it needs to be factored into the master plan from very early doors to make sure that it is viable. And with that in mind, it does come back to the responsibility of the master developer, and also making sure that the phasing is delivered in a way that enables you to actually start to look at this sustainable transport provision as early as you possibly can. Because once that habit's formed, it's very hard to break, even if it is something that is a fairly easy change for people to make. And so I think it is really a shared project team responsibility. I would say though, generally though, that it's perhaps less down to residents associations, because once you're sort of through to that physical built infrastructure stage, they are dealing with what they're given, I suppose, a bit more than being able to shape the way that those first phases can come forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. Conscious that we're pretty much running up to the end of our time again, so I'll just finish with a question to all three of you on the basis of what we've discussed today. Obviously, the potential for additional costs. If your client was asking you, should we be driving ahead with this? Is there a business case to bring in these higher standards ahead of 2025 when they'll become part of regulation? Would you say yes or no? Do you think there's tangible benefits to the delivery of the scheme? Danny?
Yes, definitely. I think 2025 will be here before you know it. And so I think we need to start planning for it now. Otherwise, we'll be regretting it in 5 years' time.
Nick, what's your thoughts?
I think if you don't start thinking about it and looking at it in any development model that you're looking at now, you'll be behind the curve, and there'll be others that come way past you a lot quicker. So yes, is the answer.
Mr. Bentley?
I think it's inevitable, Neil. We need to do it. My honest opinion, I think it will be drip fed in, and then there will be a big panic at the end. We need to do it. So let's wait and see.
You're adopting that optimistic view as ever, David. Brilliant.
I think it's we need to do it, don't we? So I'm not convinced yet, but let's wait and see.
Excellent. Well, I think that brings us to a nice close. Hopefully that's been another useful session. Thanks very much for engaging. We've now moved on in a couple of weeks' time to the fourth and final webinar in the series, when we again will be hearing probably from Nick, Danny and David, the value that can be driven through good design. So look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks, and sort of enjoy the rest of the sunny afternoon. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.